All right, guys. So we can save some time for questions, or you can just shout out with any questions along the way as we go. So we're just having another discussion related to endurance in this aerobic capacity phase that we're building right now in this first 4 weeks. And Z presented on the testing for the aerobic and lactate thresholds via the testing that we have, which is like using the MAF formula and then using the nasal breathing test, and then the other more higher intensity test for determining what heart rate is associated with your lactate threshold. So I kind of wanted to go into more detail on understanding these terms and like what we should sort of, how we can maybe learn about them from a variety of different ways, and then arrive at a big picture look at endurance overall and some of the physiology behind it. So we can improve our endurance by applying capacity or utilization training principles. And so when we talk about capacity training, which is what we're really focused on in this first 4 weeks, is we're talking about improving long-term performance and having those be lasting and built even over years, and especially when you're talking about aerobic capacity. And so the utilization training we're going to see when we get more into phase 2 and 3 of this training cycle, where we're talking about building more near-term performance results related to creating utilization specific to our sport or specific to certain body areas or muscles or movement patterns. So when we're in our capacity training phase, what we're really doing with our aerobic capacity is trying to improve our muscles' ability to produce ATP via the aerobic metabolic pathway. And why is that superior? Well, because it yields a lot of energy. It yields 36 ATP. And so it yields a lot, but it is slower and it requires oxygen. So what we're doing when we kind of stay in the aerobic capacity building, this zone 1, zone 2 work on the inside, like at the cellular level, we are increasing our capillary density. We're increasing the amount of mitochondria that we have, which are the little organelles that are our little aerobic ATP factories. And those mitochondria are super rich and dense in our slow twitch type 1 muscle fibers. We're improving aerobic enzymes, and enzymes always catalyze reactions in our body. So we're able to do more enzymatic action. Everything becomes more efficient as we build this capacity. And we're even also working at increasing our cardiac output. Whereas our anaerobic capacity building, which we will do some of, and that's a little bit more of the higher intensity work that you'll see related to like zone 3 work or interval training or the fartlek type intervals, is for that we are improving the ability of the glycolytic metabolism system. And that's a quicker process. It's 100 times faster than the oxidative system, but you only get a few ATP and you end up getting this byproduct called pyruvate. And if pyruvate isn't dealt with, pyruvate is what breaks off into lactate and a hydrogen ion and ends up creating the cellular acidosis that we're all familiar with that ends up shutting down work at a certain point. So we need anaerobic capacity when we want to use that engine, but for most of what we want to do, which is sustained endurance type travel or performance, we want to be really utilizing our aerobic metabolic pathway because we're going to be able to sustain that work longer. So as our body is motoring around, this is a drawing I used to kind of understand the organs of blood sugar regulation. So our ability to resist fatigue is really our ability to get energy to our muscles and keep our muscles moving, right? And we want to keep them moving with fuel sources that are long lasting, and that yield a lot of that energy for the weight, or for the sort of fuel resource that we're talking about. So your body, as you're motoring along, is going to all these different organs and finding stored, like for instance, glycogen in your liver, and delivering that out as a fuel source via the aerobic metabolic pathway if you're in this zone 1, zone 2 travel. And you're also pulling out stored fat from your adipose tissue and going through beta oxidation processes in the liver. So in order to get blood sugar, this upper section is talking about that. And or if you've ingested something and you want that fuel to be utilized by your body, and you're going to lower blood sugar, that fuel is going to be taken in kind of in the lower half of this diagram. But I just wanted to show you that this is what's happening behind the scenes. And a lot of what we're doing in this capacity phase overall is improving the efficiency of this blood sugar regulation system. And we are interested in being in fat burning versus predominantly in sugar burning when we're talking about endurance work. So this aerobic threshold is associated with a certain intensity, right? And below your aerobic threshold, you have all of this movement zone or movement capacity, where your perceived exertion is more on the casual or more mellow side of things, where you are interested in your heart rate, you're interested in your respiratory rate, you're even identifying the sensations associated with changes in terrain or your speed, and you're dialing in what is the maximal amount of work I can sustain at that maximal intensity before kicking over that threshold into a different predominant energy system. So when we're in and sub our aerobic threshold, we are predominantly using the fat burning oxidative system. And as a result, this type of intensity can be maintained for hours, right? Or even in some athletic cases for days. Your breathing is controlled and slow, and your blood lactate has risen only modestly when you're trained. And so you really don't have those byproducts that are gumming up the systems and resulting in a decrease of ATP production in the end, which when you cross over your thresholds, you end up slowing down, you end up needing to stop, take a break, or you feel like you've bonked. So we could kind of talk about, like, there's times to deliver that type of work, that higher intensity work, and then there's times to deliver the lower intensity work. And what we've found through all of the research and looking at the highest level athletes across all sports across the world is that they're somewhere in the vicinity of doing 80% of their work in that lower intensity zone 1, zone 2, oxidative aerobic capacity building zone. And then they're doing maybe 10 to 20% in the higher intensity zone. So the lactate threshold is it relates to the cellular mechanism where lactate production exceeds its removal. So you're talking about anaerobic work, and you're talking about the primary fuel source being glucose or sugar stores, not fat stores. And your body kicks into that glycolytic work when it has an intensity that it needs to meet more quickly. And so it's giving you a faster route to that fuel and energy via the glycolytic system. But the problem with it is it's unsustainable. Like if you're kind of butting up against your lactate threshold, and your lactate levels are now more than modestly elevated, they're sort of climbing a little bit precipitously, that junction where you're going to kick over your lactate threshold is the maximal intensity that can be sustained for about an hour or less, maybe, you know, like in that 40-minute zone, right? Which is where somewhere in that zone where that test is asking you, what is the maximal intensity that I can sustain before I cross over, and I'm going to be shut down from work or sustainability because of the metabolic byproducts that are actually jamming up the system.
If you had no sensation of pain and you're beyond your lactate threshold, what would eventually happen to your body?
You would just slow down, probably. Yeah, in that case, you would literally slow down because your body doesn't have the same ability to produce ATP because of the cellular acidosis situation.
Yeah, I just wondered what would give. Would you pass out or would?
I don't think so. I think your body has enough, your brain has enough control to say, we're just going to slow you, or we're going to stop you from being able to move any further, because the brain always is selfish and interested in its own fuel sources, and it needs glucose, and it will prioritize shutting down your locomotion for preservation of its ability to still work. And it needs the same energy as your muscles do.
My other question was, our capillary density can increase, but we don't ever get any more vein mass, right? Like you don't ever.
Actually, I don't know the answer to that, Randy, but it's a little less important, the removal of blood at that point. What helps you deal with excess lactate, pyruvate, that really it's the pyruvate molecule that you want to deal with before it becomes lactate and a hydrogen ion, is this lactate shuttle system that we're talking about. So yeah, I think your question is like, if we can improve capillary density and like the arrival of oxygen and blood to our working muscles, what about this removal feature, right? Is that kind of where you're going? Like, how do we get it
Sort
out?
of. It was probably it was even simpler than that. Though I was just thinking, we can get more capillaries. Can we get more veins?
I think so. I mean, if I look at my forearms when I'm highly trained in a climbing season, I have visually more veins than I do when I'm not. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I think your body will adapt on both ends potentially, but I just don't quite know if that's just more visible or if there are more of them. But for sure, the capillary density is what we get through the aerobic capacity building. And then we talked about mitochondrial density and the richness of the mitochondrial organelles in our slow twitch fibers. Cardiac output is another feature of aerobic capacity building. And then those enzymes. So once we go beyond the LT, exercise duration will last for seconds to minutes. So we can do seconds and minutes of work there. We just can't expect to keep climbing up that hill. When we've crossed over, we're going to either slow down or we're going to stop.
Esther, is it only one system or the other? Is it binary?
No, it's not. It's a mix always. And I think the next slide will show that for you. One sec. Right here. So sub-aerobic threshold, left of that aerobic threshold vertical line that's associated with a certain work intensity. We're in primarily fat burning, but it's not exclusive. And you'll see that for many of us, we don't have very efficient or well-developed fat metabolism pathways. Those have to come with training too. And it's not just training towards fat metabolism in our endurance bouts, but it's also training our body towards fat metabolism in our daily life. So there's a lot of different techniques that can help us bias our system towards fat metabolism. And then there's pitfalls that we run into that doesn't help us, which would be like, over consuming refined carbohydrates, sugars, sweeteners, fruit juices, that type of dietary intake. But then another thing related to whether we're stressed or not, like whether we're in our parasympathetic state or sympathetic state, like we'll be driven more towards glucose burning if we're in that sympathetic state. So there's always a mix going on. And what we want to try to do through this aerobic conditioning and capacity building is help to train you into fat burning, which is why one of the things that Z has offered is, hey, what if you do your 60 to 90 minute zone 1, zone 2 slightly fasted, like first thing in the morning. So you fasted all night, you get up, you have some water, hydrate, and you go for your zone 1, zone 2. Your body will go to, if you go back to that sugar, you know, kind of organ slide, your body will go and try to resource glycogen out of the liver. So it's going to use that. Sometimes it'll use that pathway more because it's quicker, and you get you kind of have easier access to those glucose stores. And then beyond that, you're going to be going into your stored fat. And stored fat comes from not just intake of fat, but actually intake of glucose that gets stored as fat. So in the low intensity work, we're able to be primarily fat burning because that's the engine we're using. We're driving our Prius engine at that point, right? But if we want to switch and we want to rev things up and we want to go faster, or we really want to have speed or power associated with movement, our body will switch gears or switch engines and use a better engine for that demand. But we want our work to have like sort of a greater expansion in this aerobic zone, because overall, even when we're getting into higher intensity, the more aerobic capacity we have, the more we're able to absorb higher intensity work. So we'll talk about that in a second. And the only other line to see on this graph is the anaerobic threshold, or your lactate threshold. So we just kind of went over the definitions of those two areas on the graph. So if we want to raise our aerobic and lactate threshold, how do we do that? Well, the first thing we can do is to increase our aerobic capacity. So this means that if let's say your MAF is a 133 heart rate, and you do your aerobic capacity training, your zone 1, zone 2 work at that 133 heart rate, you can actually get faster at that same heart rate. So, or you can do more aerobic work into higher intensity. So maybe you can stay in below your aerobic threshold and you'll be at your 133 heart rate, but you can start to climb, right? And go up a mountain and still stay sub aerobic threshold. Whereas perhaps when you're untrained, you'll kick over that threshold really quick as soon as a hill comes. Or if you try to get faster, you won't be really moving the threshold over, you'll be tripping over it. So we're interested in moving the aerobic threshold to the right. And we do this by that mitochondrial density, by all of those features that you get from your aerobic training. That's what is increasing that threshold and moving it to the right. And we can also even help move our lactate threshold, where we can sustain more work before lactate just goes off the charts, right? By improving what's called the lactate shuttle system. So step 1 work is sort of the low intensity work. We improve our lactate shuttle system by doing higher intensity work. But before we can have a place to shuttle the lactate, we have to improve the vacuum or the sponge of our aerobic system. Because what happens when we produce this byproduct pyruvate with our anaerobic work, which is always happening as a mix, even when we're doing our zone 1, zone 2 work. Like let's say we go up a little hill and we kick up a notch and we run that glycolytic engine a little bit. Well, what happens to that byproduct if we have an efficient mitochondrial rich, oxidative, slow twitch muscle fiber system? That system will absorb and shuttle the pyruvate and actually turn it into fuel. But for untrained individuals, or if we never really go into harder, higher intensity work, we don't train that shuttle system to get the pyruvate over into the mitochondria to be recycled and used as fuel instead of creating the acidic environment. So I drew this diagram to kind of help my own understanding, and maybe it'll help some people. There's different ways of thinking about this zoned work. You can break zones into 3 zones. You could break it into 5. I think there's different zone systems. But the one that Z and I are kind of aligning with a little bit more is really looking at 3 zones and really just paying attention to your aerobic threshold and your lactate threshold. And so you can see that blood lactate concentration on the left against your work intensity. And post or after your aerobic threshold, which if you are training it, you're going to push that bar into higher intensity work. After that, that's where blood lactate starts to rise, right? But before that, it's not rising because you're not doing a lot of glycolytic work. You're doing a lot of oxidative metabolic work, meaning you're not producing lactate as a byproduct. So we're calling this kind of zone below your aerobic threshold as like the green zone, where you're in primary fat metabolism. So if you're able to improve your fat metabolism system, it's kind of amazing because for 1 gram of fat, you get 9 kcals of energy versus 1 gram of a carbohydrate or glucose-based fuel source, you're only going to get 4 kcal. So you get twice as many energy units from 1 gram of fat as you do 1 gram of glycogen, let's say. And the body decided to store fuel this way in fat because it doesn't require it to be stored with water, you know, because like water and oil don't mix, right? And so it ends up being that in your adipose tissue, you can store a lot more fat as fuel than you can glycogen, because overall our body stays 6 times lighter than if we drug around a whole bunch of glycogen. That's why we have 1,000, what was it, the unit, 100,000 calories of fat versus 2,000 calories of glycogen, I believe, because of that efficiency of just weight and how it's actually stored in our body. So the MAF, that 180 minus your age, plus or minus some numbers, that calculation or that formula was designed by this guy, Phil Maffetone. And I coined it as the maximum aerobic function related intensity. So what he saw when he studied elite athletes from all different types of endurance disciplines is that there was a certain heart rate where not only were they in their aerobic metabolic system, but they actually had the best biomechanics. They were the most efficient. Their form wasn't breaking down. They could go forever. They could do 100 miles of running every day for 6 days, as long as they stayed in this green zone of work. So that's where we're building the sponge, we're building the vacuum, we're improving the ability to absorb higher intensity work is if we're training in this green zone. So that's where all those studies kind of looked at these, for instance, Olympic level Nordic skiers, and they found that, oh my goodness, even though they're sprinting for 2 hours in their performance, they're doing 80 to 90% of their training in zone 1, zone 2, not zone 3. So when we want to kick it over to zone 3 and do that hard work and that high intensity anaerobic work, we want the vacuum to be ready so that when we improve the power of the vacuum, we're shuttling all that byproduct over and we're getting more fuel out of it, and we're not breaking down or bonking, like even if we're essentially sprinting for 2 hours. So the only way they can maintain zone 3 high level sprint work is because of the green zone training, and then a little bit of red zone training to improve that shuttle system, etc., right? Efficiency, all the things that come with speed, adding speed into the mix. So this MAF heart rate, he said, okay, not only are you fat burning, you can go long and slow, and you have controlled breathing, and you're not getting, you know, kind of freaked out nervous system wise. But also you're less likely to get injured because you're moving really well here. And so what he found was, if he took somebody, let's say, that was running a 15-minute mile, and he said, for the next 4 to 6 weeks, I want you doing all your zone 1, zone 2 work at your MAF heart rate, and it's 133. He would see that over time, they would take that 15-minute mile, they would stay at that same heart rate, and they would get faster and faster and faster, but not by increasing their heart rate. He would keep them training there until they plateaued. So I just thought that that was a really cool way to bring it all together, like the mechanical efficiency, the metabolic efficiency, the longevity over years and years and years of training, and then knowing when to do utilization training, which is closer to performance. And you're going to teach, you know, your system to work like a Ferrari when it needs to work like a Ferrari. And then most of the time you're going to be back in your Prius, just chugging along. So again, coming back to like the Samsara training framework and how that plugs in, that we're in this foundation building phase 1. And we're talking about building our aerobic capacity, our tissue capacity, our movement capacity. And that's really why, is because we're interested in changing and improving your aerobic threshold and making you have a big fat green zone to work in, even as the terrain gets harder, or you want to go faster. All these things that you are interested in your endurance, it can still happen when you're in the green zone. So we're really interested in improving our oxidative system. We want to get into our stored energy. We know that the most efficient stored energy for production of kcals, for ATP, for longevity over a duration of an exercise bout, all of that happens through the fat burning system. We want to improve your efficiency, your mechanical and metabolic efficiency. So we're doing that in this phase 1. And then when we get faster, it's because we're doing more ATP recycling, right? We're using that pyruvate as fuel. We're keeping this oxidative system where we get 36 ATP. And we're using this MAF sort of formula to guide us in a heart rate, but we're also saying that you're interested in realizing what those sensations are, your respiratory rate, how you feel, your mechanics, etc., are also associated with your MAF. And then this idea of this 80-20 or 90-10 rule, where you're polarizing your training, you're keeping your easy work easy, not making the easy work hard, and then you make the hard work hard. You don't want to make that too easy. So you polarize it to the green zone and out into red at about that sort of 80-20 distribution. All right, y'all.
Gotta get that thick green zone.
Yeah, it's and we'll all feel different there, right? Like we're all gonna, most of us are gonna have like a slightly different speed at which we're comfortable in our green zone. We're gonna have a slightly different heart rate. We're gonna move better or worse, given like a little toggle between. We're gonna have to play a lot with how we fuel there and kind of get to know ourselves that way. And that was really apparent for me when I went on a ski tour with Z. And it's like, overall, I'm not that much slower, but I needed my zone 1, zone 2 looked, it definitely occurred at a slower pace overall than Z's. And my fueling schedule was a little bit different than Z's. But overall, like we're going up the same mountains together and arriving not in too much of a dissimilar time, but he could just go a little faster than I could over the course of 6 hours of moving nonstop, ish, with a couple breaks.
Like aerobic threshold heart rate, is that the last needle to move? Meaning, do you first have to increase your cycling rate, etc., and then your threshold will go up, or does it all happen sideways
The
simultaneously?
aerobic threshold goes up, or are you talking about both the lactate and aerobic?
I was just trying to imagine a world where your aerobic threshold is the same, but your ATP recycling is better. So it's like your mitochondrial density has increased. So you are moving faster, but you're still at the same aerobic threshold. Is that possible, or is that not the case?
I think you would see that your aerobic threshold would change, but what might, like we said, what might stay the same is your heart rate, your MAF heart rate.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking about how closely coupled they were to each other.
I thought it was interesting just listening to that Phil Maffetone podcast, right? Where it's like, he's like, no, you keep them there because that's where they're the most efficient. That's where they're doing the most maximal aerobic function, but they're going to get quicker doing it. So I would think that for me, like as I return to my ski season and more zone 1, zone 2 work, that if I did that same tour 6 weeks from now, I'm going to go faster, but I'm
I
going to
see.
have the same sensations. I'm not going to.
It's not a numerical value like trying to PR your bench press or something. I see.
No, it's about pace.
These
but
are the
it's
optimal parameters for your body type of thing.
That's right. Yep.
Okay.
And like a good example for me, I was realizing this was when I was training to kind of turn myself into an ultra runner like 3 or 4 years ago. I had never really done any long distance running, and I gave myself 6 months to reach this goal to run across the Wind River range. And I had done all this awesome zone 1, zone 2 work for months and months and months. And I was able to run over the Tetons and this and that. And I built this huge base. I recovered really well. I never was sore. I never had any injuries. And I could do big miles, in the low 20s, etc. The last run I did before the big run in August, I went with somebody who was faster than me. She was highly trained endurance athlete. And we did an 18-mile run, and the whole time, because I was interested in not just really I wanted to stick with her to have a conversation because she was a friend. And I thought maybe I had trained up to that level to chase her around. But lo and behold, because I didn't know it, but I was over my aerobic threshold. I was way over my MAF, chasing her around for 18 miles. And my knee exploded on me at the end of that run and shut me down to where I could hardly run for 1 to 2 miles following that run. And the main thing was, it wasn't like I twisted it or fell or anything. I just had terrible body mechanics and I didn't even know it. And it was because I was in the yellow or I was in the red. I wasn't in my green zone, and I broke down and hurt myself. Luckily I was able to still kind of repair that injury and go and did the run that I had set out to do. But that was a lesson in what that MAF means biomechanically too, and metabolically, that there's this zone that we should respect and we should stay in, and we shouldn't, be competitive around this type of capacity training, that it's to each unto ourselves in a way. Some people that I'm coaching are walking right now because they can't, once they kick into a running gait, they cross over their threshold. So they're going to walk until they can run, and then they're going to stay running, right? But they're going to keep that heart rate intensity or perceived intensity below threshold.
Esther, when you're in your red zones, you're doing your intervals, what do you think the optimal time is? And after listening to that podcast, what do you think the optimum number of times per week that is?
The red zone work. Yeah. Well, Marcus, for you, when because you're going to be doing this cycling race, right? Or not, maybe not a race, but this goal,
Mm-hmm.
your red zone work should occur way closer to your performance. So you get your performance results, but they're going to be near term. so that's just one thing to keep in mind, that let's say the zone 3 work might happen on more than one day when you're closer to your performance. But maybe this time that we're doing capacity training, maybe that zone 3, that red aerobic work is happening once a week, because we want
Okay.
you still in your aerobic capacity base building, just to really improve the vacuum and the sponge as much as we possibly can. If we start working your Ferrari, it might not be applied when we want it. So we need to do that harder work closer to performance. And when it's closer to performance, let's call it phase 3 for some of us, that might happen in the 3rd month of this training cycle, then it might show up a couple days a week. But I would just say, use that 80-20 rule or 90-10. That doesn't actually shift that much. So right now, let's say you're 90% green zone, 10% red. When we get you closer to training, or we want to do utilization training, it might look like 80-20, but it's not going to, you're not going to be digging into that 80% a whole lot more than that. You're still going to be in the green zone 80%. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but they also mentioned in that they were kind of erring on the side of doing 10-minute intervals as opposed to, super red zone 30-second intervals.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. There's so many different ways to slice and chop intervals, right? And what we would do for you, Marcus, is design intervals related to the terrain that you're going to be encountering and the demands that you'll be encountering on your goal. That there's going to be hill climbs, right? Or there's going to be bursts of effort, or towards the end, or whatever. And so we're going to probably look at intervals for you that relates to your sport specificity. Same would be like if I wanted to apply red zone training to improve the lactate threshold and that lactate shuttle in the forearms of a climber, because they want to do power endurance routes or goals. I'm still going to be applying interval type zone 3 work to their climbing in a way that's specific to meet their goals, versus cycling, versus running, versus, these other endurance challenges that we have. Hey, Will.
Hey, how's it going?
Good.
Just figured out how to start checking these invites more often. So sorry I'm late, but just wanted to sit in and listen at the end.
Yeah, and they'll be recorded so you can listen to them again. But nice to have you.
Yeah, good to be here. Good to see everybody.
Cool. Any other questions, you guys?
One question I have, Esther, is just in terms of, as I'm always wondering about, what about when you get old? Because I'm always just feeling I started later, and so I just wonder about things like, increasing, lactate thresholds, if it takes longer, if those metabolic processes take longer as you get older, or if this is, I presume you would see more of a delay as you get age, just, as telomeres shorten, but I don't know. So that's just my question. What are your expectations for if you're doing this when you're older?
I think you should have the same expectations. I think maybe some of the differences in how quickly one adapts might actually occur more in the question of, have you ever trained? Are you untrained, or are you trained? That if we want to move the needle on an untrained person, it's easier and it happens a lot quicker, right, than moving the needle on somebody who's been training a long time. We have to get into the upper echelon of tweaking things and creating the right stimulus, because capacity is so broad. But I see no real indication that you wouldn't be able to achieve similar results, even if you are more older. But that I think what they see from the research is that across your lifespan, this work in the green zone is what is really contributing to longevity. So for somebody who is older, I would still just have them do so much aerobic capacity training. And then if I wanted them to, you know, really look at that zone 3 work, the red zone work, we would just apply it at appropriate levels of stimulus for them. And I think metabolically that your systems really have the sort of an equal capacity to adapt and to be efficient, even when you're older. It's like muscle stuff that sometimes gets, you know, and like collagen and things, just like our tissue matrix changes. Sometimes like strength and things like that are a little different as we age, but I think metabolically, you could have high expectations.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. Great questions.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree. I do not think this is an asymptotic curve. I think we can each progress. After last year training with Z, my time up Teton Pass was better than it was 6 years previously. So I agree with Esther. There's not a ceiling. I just have to keep listening to these gurus and keep getting better.
It's awesome, Marcus. Yeah, it's probably, I think where people get into trouble as they're older is they'll like drop into this higher intensity work and really get hosed by it. They're not dropped into the lower intensity work and given this MAF idea and just like run with that, and 80 to 90% of your work is done there. Like how much more, you know, that's really improving their biologic durability than just like tearing them up by sending somebody to like, you know, doing more of like the Tabata work or the CrossFit work or this mixed system work where you feel like you want to puke after a workout. I think that's where some of the more damage is happening, and it ends up kind of gunking up the whole system. It doesn't really allow you to build this foundation to absorb that higher intensity work, and so you don't really get anywhere. You're not improving your thresholds, and you're not really working on your form and your mechanical efficiency. So this is a different way of looking at than the mainstream way that I think people are doing a lot of their cardiovascular training right now, and even their strength training. They're making the easy work too hard and the hard work too easy, and they're not polarizing it to either end. So on your development days, you know, that's when you guys are seeing your harder work. And right now it's more like capacity building. It's harder work in terms of strength, and we're getting you working for seconds to minutes, right? But it's we're not really doing too much of your development work in the metabolic part. We're like doing a lot of your development work right now in your structural and neurologic type, you know, features of your athleticism. But Marcus, for you having such a huge base, like there's room right now for you to start to see some zone 3, you know, higher intensity metabolic work because you've had, you know, years under your belt of capacity training.
Yeah, and I agree, you know, most, you know, if you look at professional cyclists, the young kids that can, the 20-year-old kids that can put out the highest wattages can't hang with the older guys. They've had to put the hours, like you said, in the green zone under their belt to be able to handle these big endurance rides. And I think my biggest problem recently is I was just going up into the red zone all the time.
Yep.
And I have to refocus now and go back to the green zone, do all your fascial strengthening, which is making incredible visible differences. It may take me a little longer because it's so new,
Yep.
but incorporating all these features in the green zone work, you know, I've noticed physiologically the biggest changes in a short period of time.
Awesome. Super good.
But I do like people that do CrossFit because that's what keeps me in business.
Hey, me too. Yeah, me too.
Touche.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just CrossFit has its reasons for why it got so popular. A lot of it is just time, you know, what's the amount of time somebody wants to put in, because this green zone work is like volume, right? It's minutes, lots and lots of minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not a 30 or 45 minute thing, you know, you're in the 60 to 90 to 240 to 6 hour range. And that's how we're designed. We're designed to do a hell of a lot more of that type of work than we are, you know, sprinting and being crazy and glycolytic.
Mm-hmm.
So not to take too much time, but one more question on the green zone. I'm definitely one of the people that has been walking, right?
Yeah.
As part of this program. And it's been interesting to see how the walking has been beneficial just from coming back from the back injury. But I guess it is so, I mean, I'm someone that has previously not necessarily done CrossFit, but tried to do as much as I could, as quickly as I could, and seen results, also seen injuries, but lots of injuries. But is there a minimum heart rate where you lose the benefit of being in the green zone? You know, like I sometimes, like when I'm walking through the avenues and I get home and I like count up the minutes, I'm like, well, I was walking the whole time and I was trying to push my pace, but it's hard. It's just such a different mindset than what I'm used to. And I guess, I don't know if that makes sense, but is just walking enough in some regards?
It's enough if it's at your MAF, right? So
Yeah.
if you're at that maximal aerobic function, there's a term in there, maximal.
Yeah.
So it is not the least you can do in your green zone, it's the most you can do in your green zone, right? So, but if walking right now is sort of feels like the most I can do, but I'm like in my green zone, what's going to happen is if you cruise and you're walking, you're going to start to feel like, as you build your structural capacity and you're doing this fascial work, you're going to be like, I kind of feel like I'm going to like pick up my pace, and suddenly your walk turns into a jog, right?
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're like, cool, like I still feel awesome. Look, my heart rate is, you know, where I want it to be. Got all the sensations that are appropriate for green zone, and I'm jogging.
Yeah.
And then your 15-minute mile might turn down into a 10-minute mile as you improve your gait. But again, you're never really pushing over the MAF.
And you know when you're at your MAF based on heartbeat? Is that, and just,
we want you to, yeah, you can, it's a sort of target intensity. So heart rate's one, respiratory rate is another. Do you feel like you can sustain that rate for hours and hours and hours? Do you feel like if I kept at this, man, I'm going to burn out in about 40 minutes? And so there's all sorts of like, and then how's your pain? How are you moving through your hips and your ankles and right, and your spine? And all of those are part of your MAF.
that makes sense.
Yeah. And you'll be at your MAF and like, let's say, oh, you need to like do a little quick like pick up around over a hill. Well, the more you have green zone work under your belt, the more that little quick pickup doesn't just like, you know, blow your eyeballs out. That quick pickup is absorbed. You already even notice it, even though you like went over your threshold and you were in yellow or red for 90 seconds. It wasn't perilous because it got absorbed and now you're moving on, you're back into your green zone, you know? So you'll find that you'll be able to really kind of feel when you cross over and when you go back and what's sustainable. And that you'll feel better. Things will get steeper, things will get more variable, you know, But the big thing is like, is whatever terrain you're on or the intensity you choose, is you want it to be long, slow, continuous, and uninterrupted.
Yeah.
And I knew if I wanted to like hurry up, because I felt like when I was chasing Z and I was like, oh, he's up changing over. Like if I wanted to hurry up, and if I did too much of that hurrying up, I wouldn't be able to go for another hour, 2, 3, 4, 5, hours more. So I was like, just keeping it slow, keeping it in the green. I just kept it slow, and overall, it's way more efficient because I kept going for 6 hours instead of like trying to hurry or do this or that in the first 90 minutes or 120 minutes, and then kind of hose myself for the rest of the day. So I knew my MAF was like at this certain place, and it felt like a little turtley, but it was good because it was sustainable.
Yeah.
And that might be a walk. I have another runner who I'm working with who, if he runs, all of a sudden his heart rate just like goes way up, blood pressure goes way up. So he's got to be a walking until he can like get back into running without blowing over, because he just, unbeknownst to him, he's run many marathons, but unbeknownst to him, most of his running and training has been in yellow or red, and he's just like, holy shit.
Yeah.
But there's other, like, he has to get into his fat burning. He's in sugar burning because of diet and stuff. And so there's a lot of change that has to happen to make his green zone really wide. He's got like kind of a tiny green zone, and he's gonna like expand it. And he's gonna push the green zone. Randy's like, I'm judging what I say based on if Randy laughs or smiles at what I say. But sorry for calling his green zone tiny. Narrow.